Imagine this, a footballer who never really played a game of football. For almost 2 decades, one man fooled the world's biggest football clubs, coaches, and fans without ever kicking a ball in a competitive match. This is the story of Carlos Kaiser, the fake footballer who pulled off one of the greatest cons in sports history. Carlos Enrique Raposo, later known as Carlos Kaiser, had a talent for creating illusions and spinning stories. Born in 1963 in Rio Pardo, Brazil, Carlos realized early on that he had a natural gift for storytelling and charm. He could talk his way out of any situation and make people believe whatever he wanted them to. These talents would later become the foundation of his elaborate footballing hoax. Growing up, Carlos saw his friends struggling to make it in the fiercely competitive world of Brazilian football. The pressure, the grueling training sessions, the constant scrutiny, it just wasn't for him. But he still wanted the glamour, the fame, and the lifestyle of a football star. And so, the idea of becoming a fake footballer started to take shape in his mind. Carlos crafted a new persona for himself, Carlos Kaiser. The name was chosen to evoke a sense of grandeur and superiority, much like the legendary German footballer Franz Beckenbauer, nicknamed Der Kaiser. With his new identity, Carlos set out to infiltrate the world of professional football. His first step was to create a backstory that would make him appear legitimate. He claimed to have started his career at Puebla, a respected club in Mexico. This was a clever move, as it was difficult for people in Brazil to verify his claims about a foreign club. He also forged documents and photos to support his story, ensuring that anyone who did a cursory check would be convinced of his authenticity. Next, Carlos used his charm to get close to real footballers and influential figures in the sport. He would attend parties, socialize with players, and make connections with journalists. His charismatic personality made him a favorite among these circles, and soon, he was getting introduced to club officials and coaches. One of his favorite tactics to avoid playing was faking injuries. Every time he was about to be called up for a match, he would suddenly develop a mysterious muscle strain or a hamstring issue. He even bribed doctors to corroborate his fake injuries, staying on the team without ever having to set foot on the pitch. Carlos's charm and confidence were his greatest assets. He showed up at trials with a friendly smile and a believable story about his supposed career at Puebla. He'd bring along doctored photos and fake documents that showed him in action, always with a wide grin that made it hard for anyone to doubt his sincerity. One of his early targets was the Brazilian club Botafogo. Carlos walked into the club with the swagger of a seasoned professional and a bag full of tricks. He quickly befriended some of the players, who were impressed by his charisma and the tales of his supposed exploits in Mexico. They vouched for him, and soon, Carlos found himself signing a contract with Botafogo, despite not having to demonstrate his football skills. Carlos knew he couldn't avoid playing forever, so he had to come up with a foolproof plan to stay off the pitch. His favorite tactic was to claim an injury just before a match. A mysterious muscle strain here, a sudden hamstring issue there. Carlos had a vast repertoire of fake ailments. He'd even go as far as to show up to training with a bandage or a limp, adding an extra layer of credibility to his act. Another trick up his sleeve was to use his charm to win over team doctors. He'd shower them with compliments, share stories, and occasionally slip them a little something extra to ensure they backed up his injury claims. With doctors on his side, no one dared question the legitimacy of his ailments. But Carlos didn't stop there. He'd go to the club's management and talk about his dedication to the team and his eagerness to recover quickly. He'd spend hours in the gym, working on exercises that didn't require any actual football skills, all while chatting up staff and making himself appear as a committed player desperate to get back on the field. One of the most outrageous incidents was when he convinced a club he needed dental surgery. He claimed that he had severe dental issues that were affecting his performance and needed immediate attention. The club paid for an expensive treatment, and Carlos disappeared for a few weeks, supposedly recovering from his surgery. Despite all these tactics, Carlos knew he had to maintain some semblance of football knowledge to avoid raising suspicion. He'd study games and tactics meticulously, learning the lingo and the finer points of the sport. This way, he could hold convincing conversations with coaches and players, further solidifying his image as a genuine footballer. As his reputation grew, Carlos began to aim higher. He moved on to bigger clubs, always using the same tried-and-tested methods. His charm, coupled with his carefully constructed backstory, opened doors that should have been closed to someone of his lack of talent. But Carlos was a master manipulator, always staying one step ahead of those who might expose him. One of the most astonishing aspects of Carlos's con was his ability to avoid being found out even during practice sessions. He'd often fake a minor injury during warm-ups or claim he was still recovering from a previous ailment. On days when he couldn't avoid participating, he'd position himself in such a way that he wouldn't be directly involved in the action, always on the periphery, always just out of reach. Carlos's early successes emboldened him. He started to enjoy the perks of being a professional footballer, the parties, the adulation, the financial benefits. But with every new club, the risk of exposure grew. Carlos had to constantly innovate his tactics, coming up with new ways to maintain a charade. And as his con became more elaborate, the stakes became higher. One misstep could bring his entire world crashing down. Despite the constant pressure, Carlos thrived on the thrill of the con. Each successful deception was a testament to his skills as a master manipulator. And so, he continued, club after club, year after year, fooling everyone he encountered with his charm and audacity. Carlos Kaiser wasn't just a fake footballer, he was an artist, weaving an intricate web of lies that held up against the scrutiny of the football world. By the late 1990s, the cracks in Carlos Kaiser's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. His elaborate deceptions had allowed him to live the life of a professional footballer for nearly 2 decades, but the truth was finally catching up with him. The football community was growing increasingly suspicious, and Carlos's web of lies was starting to unravel. One of the key events leading to Carlos's downfall occurred during his time with the Brazilian club Vasco da Gama. Despite his best efforts to avoid playing, the club's new management insisted on seeing him in action. Carlos, unable to come up with a plausible excuse, reluctantly agreed to participate in a training session. His lack of skill was immediately apparent, and the coaches were unimpressed. Rumors began to circulate within the club, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. Journalists started digging into Carlos's past, and it became increasingly difficult for him to maintain his facade. The discrepancies in his playing history, the fabricated documents, and the stories of his fake injuries all began to surface. The media frenzy that followed was relentless, and Carlos found himself at the center of a growing scandal. Carlos's allies in the football community, who had once defended him, began to distance themselves. The relationships he had carefully cultivated were no longer enough to protect him from the mounting evidence against him. Coaches, players, and club officials started to speak out, sharing their experiences and suspicions. The weight of the accusations was overwhelming, and Carlos's reputation was in tatters. Desperate to salvage his career, Carlos made a bold move. He arranged a press conference, hoping to clear his name and regain some semblance of credibility. However, journalists bombarded him with questions about his past, and his attempts to deflect and charm his way out of trouble fell flat. The press was no longer willing to accept his stories. As the scandal unfolded, it became clear that Carlos Kaiser's career as a fake footballer was over. Clubs that had once welcomed him now viewed him as a fraud. Contracts were terminated, and his lavish lifestyle came to an abrupt end. The fallout from Carlos's exposure was significant. The football community was forced to reckon with the fact that they had been duped for nearly 2 decades. Clubs implemented stricter vetting processes for new players, and the media became more vigilant in verifying the backgrounds of athletes. Carlos's story served as a cautionary tale, highlighting the need for due diligence and skepticism in the world of professional sports. For Carlos, the aftermath was devastating. He had built his entire identity around being a professional footballer, and with that identity stripped away, he was left with nothing. The fame, fortune, and adulation he had enjoyed were gone, replaced by shame and infamy. Carlos's fall from grace was swift and unforgiving, and he struggled to find his place in a world that now viewed him as a con artist. Carlos Kaiser's story is more than just a tale of deception, it's a lesson in the power of belief and the importance of due diligence. His ability to fool so many for so long highlights how charisma and confidence can overshadow reality. If you enjoyed this look into the life of Carlos Kaiser, like this video and subscribe for more unbelievable stories from the world of sports. Thanks for watching, and stay curious and skeptical.